Hello everyone, so I'm just checking in with you guys now that I have finished Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. So this book was really interesting for me because I expected actually to like this a little bit more than I did overall. So I think what's really important upon finishing this is that actually your best experience and the most knowledge you'll gain as a reader about this topic would be to read Catch and Kill and She Said as two companion reads on the same topic. They both reference each other in the book, and towards the back end of this book, Ronan Farrow does acknowledge that the New York Times, which is the publication that Jodie Cantor and Megan Twohey worked for, were the ones that broke the Weinstein story, and that Ronan Farrow works for the New Yorker, and that they worked on a story after that, but that both pieces were useful to breaking the story, but ultimately they do acknowledge that they were working on the story parallel to one another. And obviously Ronan Farrow worked for NBC News, and ultimately they didn't want any culpability that went with the story, so they told Ronan Farrow to take it to the New Yorker. And obviously he explores that in the book and how people at NBC were too scared to have their name on this because of their associations previously with Weinstein and people that knew Weinstein. So this does go into a lot of detail about the insidiousness of sexual assault in Hollywood and in the media and in the job roles, both Weinstein's company and even at television production companies, and the whole industry is infected with it, and that's what he kind of discusses in this book. It also talks about an organisation called Booktube, which is an intelligence organisation, and how people like Weinstein have been using these services to spy on their accusers. So it discusses that, and that was quite interesting because in the She Said book it didn't really go into the spying and the intelligence organisations and things like that. But I think there was a lot of people that Ronan Farrow discussed in this book, and ultimately for me I kept losing track of who we were talking about and what we were talking about. So I found that the organisation of the book was a little bit more clunky for me, and maybe that's because an American readership will know these names more than I will, or maybe it's just because Ronan Farrow is writing this with the knowledge that he knows these people intimately, but maybe that just didn't translate that well on the page because we don't know them that intimately. So that kind of deadened my experience because there's a lot going on, and I do think this could have been condensed somewhat. Obviously this is a stylistic choice. He's written this with the journalistic lens. He has spent extensive hours fact-checking everything. I'm a reader who appreciates the story and the women. That was the bit in the book that I enjoyed the most, when he would tell us the reports and the accounts of the women's experience of their abuse. For me to say that's the most enjoyable thing sounds awful, but I love the human element and the story and the bravery of these women to come forward and the journey of that. Obviously this book goes more extensively into the backlash to the story and why the story was rejected by NBC News, which was very interesting, whereas I think She Said gets straight into the heart of the story because they didn't have as much backlash as Ronan Farrow did trying to produce the story. But those are the bits that I really enjoyed about She Said and this book. But there were other elements of this story that kind of dragged through the fact-checking, which I didn't enjoy quite as much. But I do think it's very important that you read this and She Said together, and I think this book really highlights a very pivotal historic moment in history in which Weinstein has been found out, and this has started the wave for things like the Me Too movement and trying to eradicate sexual abuse and harassment in Hollywood and in other jobs and similar mediums. So this really encapsulates a period of time, and its relevancy is still very much apparent this year. So I do think out of all the non-fictions, this is a hot ticket and incredibly relevant to the time we're living in now. So I think I'm going to give this 3.5, maybe 4. I actually enjoyed She Said more than this one, I think, but I think they're both useful tools together. And maybe it was just the wrong time to read this book. I just wasn't as engaged as I felt like I should have been. So because I'm putting it at 3.5/4, I'm going to put it above Solitary but below In the Dream House, because overall I think I enjoyed In the Dream House a little bit more than this book. It's kind of hard because In the Dream House feels like the least non-fiction of the pack, and this feels like the most non-fiction of the pack. But I think I overall just enjoyed where she went with that a little bit more. And I was thinking whether I should push it above In the Dream House, this book, just because of how important it is. But I do actually think this will probably end up in the top 3 by all the other judges because it's had such high praise. So I'm going to put it there, and that's what I'm happy with. So as I'm thinking, it probably leans more at a 4 than a 3.5 because I marked Solitary as a 4, I believe. But this just wasn't as enjoyable to read as In the Dream House. So my standings are Solitary at the bottom, 4 stars. Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, 4 stars. In the Dream House, 4 stars. Know My Name by Chanel Miller, 4 stars. And Say Nothing as 4.5 stars. And I'll catch up with you guys when I finish No Visible Bruises, which will be the last read of the Booktube Prize 2020 for me. So it will be exciting to see where everything ends up. I'm excited to get to that, and I'll let you guys know once I finish reading it where my final rankings and my wrap up lies. Hello everyone, so I have finally finished No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Schneider, and I just want to wrap up with you guys how I found this book. So I ended up giving this book 5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. I'm sorry if I'm being quiet, everybody's gone to bed and I'm trying to just film this so I can edit it so it's all uploaded on time. This really goes into a lot of detail about the process of domestic violence. So Rachel Louise Schneider talks a lot in this book about how we shouldn't really call domestic violence. She thinks it should be called intimate terrorism. And she goes through all the ways that domestic violence affects the perpetrator, the victim, the victim's family, and society at large, and how the police, advocates, counsellors, medical professionals, charities, shelter services should all be sharing information. So one of her key points here is about collaboration and communication and how effective that is to prevent domestic violence happening. She also goes into a lot of detail about gun reform and how domestic violence is a threat to society at large, particularly familicides. I don't know how you pronounce it, but the crime in which family members, for example, the parent kills the children or the partner kills the spouse, is on the rise, and particularly the most at risk are the white middle class population, and particularly those that were of a wealthy background who face financial hardships. So this book doesn't just talk about minority groups being more susceptible to violence, particularly domestic violence, how the white population are just as in danger. And it also talks predominantly about male violence against women, but it does acknowledge here briefly in some statements about how same-sex relationships follow similar statistics, and obviously does acknowledge here that there are male victims of domestic abuse. But I really loved that this book was cut into 3 sections. So the first section is dealing with a particular case, and in this book Rachel Louise Schneider visits the family of a lady who was killed by her partner, and she was killed alongside her 2 children, and it goes through the family that she's met and corroborating this story. Obviously everybody's names are changed in this book because that was a real life case study, and for privacy and confidentiality that's all been changed. But then the second part of the book goes through the perspective of perpetrators of violence. So she meets people who are doing reform programs both in and out of prison, and the effect it's had on their lives, and teaching them that they need to rewire their behaviour, particularly about masculinity and how gender is viewed, and how they have been brought up to believe that men can only express emotions through anger and that they can't be vulnerable or intimate with other people, and how toxic masculinity is a contributing factor to their violence. And then the last section of the book is kind of how she has looked at how certain states and the bureaucracy within states are trying to deal with domestic violence, and shockingly how little state intervention and protection is apparent at state level, how there is so little statutory legislation, literature, court rulings, any placement of protection or validation of the crime of domestic violence. It's not considered a criminal issue. It's often dealt with in civil courts alongside things like divorce proceedings and about who has custody of children. So the fact that in the court system it's downplayed, the fact that due to confidentiality issues, medical professionals and judges and rulings of, for example, restraining orders between states aren't shared through state lines. So for example, somebody could have a restraining order in one state and then move to the next state, start an abusive relationship with a second partner, and there would be no history in the new state. So how there's so little communication between these different areas, and how since certain states have set up police units dedicated to intimate violence and domestic violence, they have looked at all the points in a case in which there are external individuals that touch base with both the victim and the perpetrator, which had they intervened or been trained properly might be able to stop the violence from being exacerbated and being accelerated. So it talks here about how I've forgotten the name of the lady, but she set up a danger assessment tool with questions to try and help people, charity workers, people that are working in shelters, police officers when they're taking statements, to try and establish how dangerous the domestic violence situation is going to be and whether it's at the highest risk. Help people know, and then to be able to form a relevant plan based on the level of danger. So this book was so informative. It reminds me a lot of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood and I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, because it is a non-fiction but that just reads like fiction. The beginning of the book just sucked me straight in when she started talking about visiting the father of a woman who died from domestic violence and going to his house. She painted such a vivid picture, and then meeting his family, and then she kind of goes back in time to the lead up to the event of the individual's death. And then the middle section was just as compelling when she was talking to males who have been accused of the murders of their spouses or their girlfriends, or of GBH against their girlfriends, and how they're trying to turn the life around, and how it's not always as straightforward as we like to believe, and that reform is quite a complicated issue in and of itself. And it's so interesting how she talks about she has this passion for this subject, but that everybody that she came into contact with that really wants to reform these laws have been affected directly by domestic violence. They've had family members who have died because of domestic violence, or have been perpetrators of crime, of domestic violence, or they've suffered it themselves in some ways. And how she said their experience is what's fueling this need for change. They feel passionate about wanting to change the way the situation is. Just such an interesting book, and every time I picked this up I literally couldn't put it down. I was just swept away. I think her arguments are really clear and concise throughout, which I really like. I think the only reason people will downplay the rating of this book is because it doesn't involve same-sex relationship representation in here, and it doesn't represent males as victims of domestic violence here, and it does play into a lot of findings on gender and the stereotyping of male and female, masculine and feminine a lot, which some people might think is a bit reductive. But overall the writing was really good. The way she built and paced and structured this non-fiction so that it was engaging at every plot point, and the 3 overarching things that she wanted to talk about, she invested and researched into them equally in detail. She wrote them very well. It felt very balanced and well written, and it still had that really impressive, compelling, propulsive writing style to it that was just really engaging. So 5 out of 5 stars for me. I absolutely loved this book, and I kind of knew about the first chapter in that I think it was a bit like In Cold Blood with Truman Capote for me. As soon as I read the first chapter I kind of knew it would be a 5-star read. So there we have it. This is my winner for the non-fiction for the Booktube Prize 2020. I really hope it wins. I'm probably not going to be overly surprised if it doesn't, because I think this for me was just an instant love book, which I don't think everybody will have. Sometimes you just have those gut feelings when you fall in love with something, and I really feel like the judges probably aren't going to feel the same way, but this is my winner, so we'll see. In first place is No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Schneider. In second place is Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. In third place is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. In fourth place is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. In fifth place is Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. And in sixth place is Solitary by Albert Woodfox. So that is it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully I'll be back next year to judge the 2021 Booktube Prize. So I would like to say a big congratulations to all the finalists in fiction and non-fiction, and congratulations to the winners, because once this video is up they will be announced. And yeah, thank you so much, Robert, for allowing me to participate in it this year. I have loved judging both fiction and non-fiction, and I cannot wait to find out who wins. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.